Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to walk you through my ethnography project, where I explore how people use fashion, especially thrifted clothing and sneakers, to express who they are and the communities they connect with. We see fashion every day, but we don't always think about what it communicates. Whether it's a thrifted jacket or a pair of hype sneakers, clothing can carry stories about identity, values, creativity, and belonging. In this project, I spent time in thrift stores and sneaker retail spaces collecting academic research and developed interview questions to better understand how people think about what they wear and why it matters. So, before we get into the interviews or the findings, we need to start with the question that guides everything in this project. My research question is: how do people in thrift and sneaker or hype based retail settings use fashion to express identity, values, and social belonging? Basically, I want to understand what clothing represents for people in these two different spaces. For thrift shoppers, style is often about creativity, individuality, or sustainability. For sneaker and hype shoppers, fashion can be tied to brand knowledge, design culture, and being part of a broader community. What I'm really trying to figure out is how clothing becomes a way for people to say something about themselves and how it helps them connect with others, whether that's through secondhand fashion or through sneaker culture. For my hypothesis, I kept things pretty straightforward. First, I expect thrift shoppers to express their identity through creativity and sustainability. Thrifting often gives people a chance to build a unique style or choose pieces that reflect personal values like reuse or individuality. Second, I expect sneaker and hype shoppers to express identity in a different way, mainly through brand knowledge, design, and belonging to hype culture. For a lot of people, certain sneakers or brands represent taste, status, or being part of a specific community. Even though these two groups shop in totally different environments, I think they both use fashion to communicate who they are. And finally, I expect that clothing plays a big role in helping people feel connected to the social groups they identify with, whether that's the thrift community, the sneakerhead scene, or something in between. For this project, I use a combination of observation, interviews, and academic research to understand how people use fashion in thrift and hype spaces. First, I did participant observation in both thrift stores and sneaker/hype retail stores. I paid attention to how people dressed, how they interacted with products, and the kind of style choices they seemed to express something about identity or belonging. I also interviewed between 6 and 8 people using my approved interview questions. These conversations help me understand how shoppers think about their style, what influences them, and what their clothing says about who they are. While I was observing and interviewing, I kept detailed field notes so I could track patterns and themes as they came up. And finally, I used 3 peer reviewed articles to help give cultural context and support the patterns I noticed in my own data. One focused on thrift identity, one on sneaker culture, and one shapes on how apparel shapes personal identity overall. Together, these methods give me a fuller picture of how fashion actually works inside these two different cultural spaces. Before getting into my findings, it's important to understand the cultural backdrop behind these two spaces. Thrift culture is often centered around creativity, sustainability, and individuality. People who thrift usually enjoy the idea of creating their own unique look, finding one of a kind items and expressing their values through secondhand fashion rather than buying mainstream trends. On the other hand, sneaker and hype culture is built around brand meaning, status, and community. People who shop at these spaces often care about things like limited releases, design stories, and being part of a larger fashion scene. Their clothing and shoes signal knowledge, taste, and connection to a community that values certain brands and styles. Even though these two cultures look different, they both use fashion as social signaling. Clothing becomes a way of expressing identity and belonging, just in a different style and language depending on the group. When I started observing shoppers in thrift stores, one of the first things I noticed was how personal and creative the environment felt. People weren't just grabbing whatever was trendy, they were taking their time digging through racks and really curating the pieces that felt unique to them. A lot of the outfits I saw mixed vintage items, different eras, and different textures. It gave off this vibe that people weren't dressing to fit in, they were dressing to express themselves. I also noticed that sustainability seemed to matter to a lot of thrift shoppers. Things like reusing materials, giving clothes a second life, or avoiding fast fashion all seemed to shape how people talked about what they were buying. Overall, the thrift store observations lined up with my hypothesis. People here use fashion as a form of identity, something creative, expressive, and often very personal. Now, shifting to the sneaker and hype retail side, I noticed some very different patterns. First, people weren't just shopping for shoes, they were performing what you could call brand identity. A lot of shoppers talked openly about certain brands, specific collabs, or the rarity of a release. You could really see how brand knowledge becomes a form of social capital in these spaces. Another thing that stood out to me was the sense of community. Even strangers would start conversations about what someone was wearing, upcoming drops, or whether they got a certain pair. It almost functioned like its own social environment where people bond through shared style, language, and hype culture. And overall, outfits were much more coordinated and intentional. People weren't only dressing clothes, or people weren't only wearing clothes, they were signaling status, taste, and belonging through the brands they choose and how they put everything together. So identity is definitely being expressed, but in a more curated, brand centered way compared to the thrift side. Now, let's talk about some of the themes that came up in my interviews. One of the strongest patterns I noticed is that people really see clothing as a part of who they are. Whether they shop at thrift stores or sneaker/slash hype shops, a lot of them talked about fashion as a way of expressing personality, their values, or even their mood. For many, the act of choosing what to wear isn't just random, it's intentional and tied to identity. Another theme was community. People mentioned that certain styles or brands help them feel connected, like they fit into a specific group. For thrift shoppers, that might mean being part of a sustainability minded or creative crowd, and for sneaker collectors, it's about being connected to a wider culture that values knowledge, brand history, and design. I also heard a lot about change. Many interviews, Many interviewees said that their fashion habits have evolved over time, sometimes because they became more confident, sometimes because they discovered new spaces like thrifting or hype culture. These shifts often reflect changes in how they saw themselves. And finally, media influence showed up everywhere. People mentioned that social media, influencers, and even their friends shape what they're drawn to. Sometimes they try something new because they saw it online or because it's trending in a community they want to be a part of. Overall, the interviews helped me see that fashion choices are not just practical decisions, they are statements about identity, community, and connection. Now that I gathered my observations and interviews, a few themes really stand out. First, fashion functions as a form of identity work across both groups. Whether something is digging through Whether someone is digging through thrift racks or buying the latest sneakers, they're using clothing to express who they are and what they value. These spaces might be different, but the purpose is actually very similar. Second, each environment encourages its own type of expression. The thrift stores bring out creativity, individuality, and sustainability. Hype and sneaker spaces highlight brand knowledge status, and a sense of being part of a larger cultural movement. Even though the intentions differ, both groups essentially do the same thing: community belonging through how they dress. Another pattern I noticed is the importance of community signals. People choose outfits with certain audiences in mind. Sometimes it's about fitting into a subculture, and other times it's about being recognized by the right group, whether that's thrift friendly creatives or sneaker collectors. And finally, the meaning behind the clothing mattered more than the price. Whether it was a $5 find or a $200 drop, participants talked more about personal story, values, and self expression more than cost. Although the data shows that fashion isn't just surface level, it's a tool people use actively to shape identity and navigate social belonging. Like any ethnography project, mine came with a few challenges. First, my sample size was small. I was able to interview and observe several people in thrift slash hype retail environments, but not enough to say that these patterns represent everyone. These are just trends that emerge within the groups I talk to. I also had a relatively short time frame for doing fieldwork, so my observations were limited to the specific days and times I was able to visit these stores. That means I might have missed different kinds of shoppers or people who behave differently during busier hours or special events. Another limitation is participant bias. Some people might have described their fashion choices in ways that sounded socially responsible or thoughtful, even though that's not really the full story. Finally, the two environments I studied, thrift stores and sneaker slash hype shops, operate very differently. Thrifting is slower and more exploratory, while hype retail is more curated and fast paced, I would say. Those differences can make direct comparisons more difficult, but they also highlight how identity gets expressed in unique ways across these different spaces. So, to wrap everything up, this project showed that fashion is much more than clothing people put on. In both thrift spaces and hype or sneaker retail environments, people use what they wear to communicate something about who they are and what matters to them. Thrift shoppers often express individuality, creativity, and values like sustainability or resourcefulness. Meanwhile, people in hype and sneaker culture lean into brand knowledge, design details, and community trends to signal belonging and status. Even though these groups look different on the surface, they both do the same thing, using fashion as a form of identity work. What really stood out to me is how socially shaped these choices are. People dress not for themselves, but for the communities they want to be a part of, whether that's thrift culture, sneaker culture, or something in between that. Overall, this study helped me see that clothing isn't just about uh, something people wear, it's a language, and through that language, people create, express, and express themselves and put themselves in the world. And that's about it. Thank you.